welcome back to the Skillist podcast. I'm Brad Salon from the Roots School in Vermont.
I am Matt Corradino from Caribbean Earth Skills in the Caribbean, Virgin Islands, St. Croix. Come on!
All right, so this week we're going to talk about fire.
Fuego.
Fire. A topic that is near and dear to both our hearts, I'm sure. Was fire one of the things that you were like always hype on, like from the time you were a kid?
You know, I can't really say that I was, honestly. That's an interesting question. No, I can't really say that I was. I think when I started learning this stuff, it was like, you know, that first challenge that was put before me, you know, as a student, like making a fire by rubbing sticks together. I think just honestly, like just being out in nature was kind of the thing that got me. I know usually for a lot of kids, it's like archery or hunting or fire or something like that. For me, it was just literally just being in the woods. But definitely was like that first challenge where I was challenged with it. You know, I got a bow drill cold pretty quickly and then struggled mightily afterwards for a long time.
Yeah.
So it was tough in that way. So yeah, it was definitely the first one that really like I dove into a lot because it was hard. I think of it like, especially fire by friction, it's a huge equalizer. No matter how good you get at it, you're going to run into problems. There's going to be like a slightly wet day or like a slightly wet kit, or I don't know if you remember when we were at the Mid-Atlantic Primitive Skills group, the one year somebody brought some basswood, which is like a great bow drill wood, and there was like that piece of wood where it just like you couldn't get a coal with it. Like nobody could get a coal with that thing. So you're always going to have those challenges with it. And I also find it's like so easy to tell if somebody is skilled or not by how they are at fire by friction.
Yeah.
Like it's so instantaneous. Like, oh, they haven't spent time with this.
Right.
Like you could just tell immediately.
Yeah, man.
Or, yeah, I mean,
for me, it was always one of those things, like as a kid, just having a campfire, whether I was like camping with my parents or when I went to camp and there was one match fire making, like it was always so exciting to me. It's such it's an exciting element. Even like as an adult after all these years, like just taking the kids out and having a fire in the woods for no real reason other than the fun of it. Like it's still always, as soon as that fire really gets kicking, it's comforting and it's like an exciting friend to welcome into the scene. But yeah.
You know, it's not something that I tend to think of as much until it's lit. Once it's lit and I'm sitting around it, then I'm like, oh, damn, that's right. This is like really sweet. I do enjoy this stuff. And I definitely find that for students, I mean, specifically fire by friction, it's like a really easy connection for people. Like it's a really easy inroad to get people stoked on it because it's a big challenge for beginners, but it's like it doesn't usually, if you have a skilled instructor, it really doesn't take very long for you to start getting smoke and start to, you know, it's like an instantaneous, oh, whoa, okay, if I can make smoke, I can make fire.
Right.
Definitely not always the case.
Right. No, I agree. With a good instructor too, you can have success pretty quickly, and it gives that like sense of I overcame a challenge.
Totally.
And then that opens the door to all sorts of other things.
Yeah, and also the carving skill, really.
Right.
I mean, fire by friction, like that, it seems really simple, but like carving a notch, carving a good solid spindle, you know, like making it actually straight and cylindrical, you know, getting that fireboard like actually rectangular, and then fitting the handhold to your hand really good. It's like it's pretty much all that you'll ever need to learn in carving. I mean, other than really technical stuff, but like just those motions of, you know, those knife motions of carving all the bow drill parts specifically. It's like once you've done 5 or 10 bow drill kits, like you could carve most anything you want. It might be some learning curve in there, but yeah, it's really great for learning the carving part. But you know, even like aside from the bow drill itself, I feel like the fire, right? Managing and burning a fire in the most efficient way is not necessarily like the most practiced skill. I mean, so I lived in a shelter for like 7 years, and having a fire burn down efficiently with as little smoke as possible and like as little wood as I could possibly use to get the maximum amount of flame and warmth from it, like that was a big deal. I mean, I didn't want to be spending, you know, inordinate amount of time gathering firewood and preparing it. So that ended up being like a huge skill, just like, you know, burning a fire. It's not hard, right? You just put the wood on in the right place, but to not have the smoke in your face and cooking over a fire especially.
Oh yeah, man. I think that is a huge skill. Like, you know, we do a bunch of shelter stays with groups of people, and people who can't tend to fire well will smoke the whole group out, right? Like, not in the good way. But like, you know, they'll like, people who don't know to keep the center of the fire from getting too choked with ashes, people who don't know to lay sticks on so that you're always recreating that 45-degree angle, people who don't know, like, if you do have wet wood, you need to be pre-drying wood in like a conveyor belt as it gets closer and closer to being thrown in. There's like all these little...
Or using that, like when to use that,
right?
You know, like especially here, you know, for doing the survival trips, like the hardwood is actually pretty hard to come by for fires, you know, like a good solid hardwood. And the wood just burns up so quickly and you're left with really poor coals. But like knowing how much green wood to put on, right, how long to expect it to burn down, getting better coals from green wood. I mean, that's like a massive skill set right there, you know, just like figuring out how to manage your firewood pile. It doesn't sound like a very big thing, but you know, even if it's like a week-long trip into the bush, it gets super annoying, like just spending like more time cutting and splitting wood than doing anything else, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially if you have a shelter that relies on fire for heat, which I am so not into.
Right. Down there, you find yourself relying on fire for like cooking and mosquito management or bug management, or...
Definitely bug management, but you know, it's mostly cooking, and it's really kind of a big deal because you're not trying to stay hot. Warmth is not a problem.
Right.
And it's kind of more pleasant, you know, I get it. You just build a big ass fire and you have a ton of coals, and that's great. But then like keeping those coals going, if I have to, you know, if I have to only cook a certain amount of food, why go and spend all that time gathering all that wood, burning a fire that I can't hang out by, like cooking on coals where I'm like already sweating all day long. I don't want to keep sweating at the end of the day. Hold on just a second. Hey, you kids. Yeah. You got to go somewhere else with that noise. So, sorry everybody. I have kids. Yeah, I mean, after a long, hot day in the sun, jeez, I give them too much freedom. You guys got too much freedom over there, you kids. I voted. So anyway, yeah, you know, you don't want to sit by like a raging hot fire at the end of the day. You're trying to cool down at this point, you know. So like, knowing which wood to go for, like, you know, preheating your food, preheating your wood, like it's definitely a challenge. Another thing that we don't allow anybody to use headlamps unless it's an emergency. We have them for medical needs, but we do torches. We do coconut shell torches for light. So I mean, the fire is providing the cooking fuel, and it's providing our light at night.
Yeah.
And you know, the coconut shells are kind of cheating in that regard. It's like such a perfect torch. You still have to have a fire to preheat them usually. To get
what
them
part
lit.
of the shell?
Just use the whole shell. I don't have a torch sitting here on me, but I basically make a cup, right, or a bowl with a little cup coming off the bottom, and the cup on the bottom is to stick a stick into, to have it on a you know, like on a stick, so you're not just can't hold it in your hand because it gets too hot. And then the bowl holds the coconut shells, and you punch holes in it when you're making, and I'm making them out of clay, right? It's a clay bowl with a cup coming out the bottom with holes punched in the bowl area, and then you light the coconut shell on the fire and then just stick it in the bowl, and it just shoots out flames. It's a really bright flame. They're really awesome
Like
torches. You kind of have to feed them.
Like the dark colored shell, like the inner shell.
The shell, the hard shell,
Yeah.
the wooden shell, not the husk.
Right.
Now the husk we use for mosquito control.
Right.
Just stick some of those on some coals and get them nice and smoky. My preference is the locust sap, right? Locust, the West Indian locust sap. It's like it smells like copal incense, so it's like a nice fragrant incense. And the other thing we use is the termite mound, right? They build these mounds on the trees, and it's basically like like powdered wood that they glue together, and that works pretty well. But it's hard to keep those from bursting into flame. The coconut husk is a little better for keeping the bugs at bay. But yeah, the husk is for keeping the bugs at bay, and the shell itself is for the torches.
That's cool.
It's fun messing with it during a survival trip like that, but like again, it's if you're somewhere cold, it's great. You want a hot fire, no big deal. Just build it really big and hang out by it. But somewhere hot, it's like you don't want to spend any more time around the heat than you already are. Especially for people who aren't from here. I can deal with it. My body's used to that high heat, so like it's not as big of a deal for me. But even for me, at the end of the day, I'm like, all right, it's been hot all day. I'm ready for it to cool down. And it starts getting cooler, and now the fire has to get built up. And so usually the first night or two, either myself or Carmen are doing the cooking so that the students see how much you can cook on less heat. But then usually people just build these massive, enormous fires that you can't really hang out by because it's just too damn hot.
Right. Do you do the trick where you keep like a little fire going to one side, and that's like feeding coals into your cooking fire? That's what we find ourselves doing that a lot.
And we have some stones. We have some pieces of soapstone that we have holes drilled in them and we're just using those to cook in the calabash, which is like a gourd.
Right.
So we have that over top of some coals, and then we have a fire to the side like you're talking about. A lot of times we're building it up big for the first time and making a bed of coals and then having another side fire. And then we kind of get to a point where it's either the potatoes or the corms or roots or whatever we have cooking gets cooked, and then we have to build it up again. It's a little trickier when we catch some meat. Usually we end up eating, we'll catch a goat, or we've gotten deer before, and it's usually 8 to 10 people, and we'll finish off that goat in a night most of the time. But sometimes there's like a leg left over, and it can be a little bit of a headache. Like you're trying to keep enough heat to slowly roast that. We don't do a lot of drying. We don't make a lot of like dried meat product because sometimes we do when students are really into that, but otherwise we're just eating it,
Right.
And then cooking it really well the one night, and then cooking it over the coals, like when people are already full or full enough to stop eating, like keeping the thicker cuts of meat cooking through the night. It's only a headache because there's not. It sounds crazy that you wouldn't find a whole ton of hardwoods in a tropical forest, but all those hardwoods were cut down a long, long, long time ago. And so in that second and really third generation forests, it's softer woods. There are some hardwoods, but they're fewer and farther between. So like it's definitely like a skill that people don't expect to be working on. People are expecting to be working on spearing or hunting or foraging or building the shelter. And people are usually surprised by how much time they spend sitting around the fire and like just managing a fire like that.
Yeah, it's like a heart and soul of the camp. If you're living primitively, we've done a bunch of those Origins trips or the Wilderness Survival Immersion Project trips, where you're out for like the whole time and that's your only food and light and heat source. And yeah, it becomes like its own really fine relationship of like how to bank the coals so that you can come back to them, how to like get your temperatures right, like what are you cooking. If you're cooking roots and you want to like mix white wood ash with coals in a 50-50 mix so that it insulates but heats, and then you can like bake stuff in that. Or if you're cooking meat, you want it to be like directly on hot coals or on a hot rock, or there's do you want a fire that kicks off maximum amount of light? Like it's a really tall teepee fire with smaller sticks. Like refining your firewood gathering and your breaking down of your firewood so that it's sorted, so that like as you're working the fire, you can just grab what you need and you have like the ability to really control it in a really defined way and control your heat, control your light, and be able to be really functional about it, as opposed to just like one fire fits all sort of situation.
That collection aspect is huge if you're not bushcrafting out there and bringing a hatchet with you.
Right.
I think I was mentioning earlier about like, spending all my time cutting and splitting wood. Like, I'm not talking about with a hatchet. I'm talking about like primitively, it's like you got to have stuff that you can break, or space around your fire, which, it's like ends up being the biggest headache, having big logs that are part way sticking in the fire and like sticking out of the fire, and it's fine for the first 45 minutes, but then somebody forgets about it, walks over, kicks that log that's like you're burning in half, and like it ends up being a headache, and you end up using a lot smaller wood than you ever would think, or that you definitely do if you're using a wood stove.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it's like just breaking down the wood. That's another thing with like the hardwood softwood mix. It's like a lot of the hardwoods that we have access to, it's like they're bigger logs because they don't degrade as quickly, or it's a heartwood is the hardwood. But I'm wondering, because you're in Vermont, and Vermont is like, because of all the sheep farming that went on before World War II, it's like full of softwoods, lots of evergreens. How much do you prioritize like having a hardwood forest as your spot for your shelter, or do you not prioritize that because of firewood?
Well, I mean, it's two reasons. One is for debris. Like if there's a debris element to the shelter builds, then you're going to be leaning towards the hardwoods. And then two, yeah, the firewood collection. Like if you're doing fire in a shelter, it's kind of a non-starter. Like you can definitely give yourself pine fever by burning only softwoods in your shelter and breathing all that sappy smoke. So you're definitely going for like, my thumb thickness, like 1 inch thick and smaller diameter hardwood for your in the shelter burning. And then, outside you burn whatever the hell you have. But even then we try and, if it's cooking fire, we're trying to aim towards the hardwoods. But yeah, it becomes a lot of work, even for like, a bigger group. Everybody's got to spend, at least an hour a day or more gathering and breaking down wood. And people learn an efficiency of like, okay, I go down and I find dead standing saplings. I push them over. I drag back the entire, like 6 saplings, 10 saplings at once. Then there's a camp breaking tree, which is, a tree that's either 2 trees close together or a tree with a big V in it that you can, break stuff off in, and that becomes like a major use. And then, yeah, there's like firewood processing is a major part of the work, the community work of any trip like that.
Yeah, I was, you had mentioned the pine fever, and I was remembering like the only time I ever had anything close to that is I was doing this road trip with this friend of mine. He's also into primitive skills. And we were in Oregon, kind of close to Bend, between Crater Lake and Bend, and we stopped at this spot in this national forest, and there were all these big ponderosa pines, really pretty area, and then like as soon as it got to evening time, the mosquitoes just descended in the most horrendous fucking horde I've never had it that bad, ever. And we started this fire, and we were basically like throwing green pine boughs into the fire all night and standing in the smoke just to keep the mosquitoes off of us.
Yeah.
And then I ended up retreating to the car, and he didn't. He was all pissed at me. Oh, I can't believe you went in the car. Oh, it's bullshit. You're cheating. It's such bullshit. I was like, whatever. And the next morning, I got up, had to go to the bathroom, which was horrible. Trying to go to the bathroom with all those mosquitoes biting the crap out of me, literally. And I went up to the fire, like to start it again. And I remember looking at the ashes, and I was like, man, that's a weird color gray. It was like a strange color gray. It wasn't like the lighter gray of the ashes. And I went to like stir the ashes to see if there was a coal in there. And it was a solid blanket of mosquitoes. That was the gray color. And as soon as I touched those ashes, it was just like a cloud of mosquitoes came off. I mean, like it seemed like a million mosquitoes right there. And I was like,
God.
we are leaving. We're not cooking breakfast. We are leaving right now.
Yeah.
That was the worst. But it was definitely like, I felt that. I felt that pine fever. Breathing in all that pine smoke. Definitely no bueno.
Yeah, it's gnarly. Yeah, man. So that's a big use for us in the fire in the summer is fire for mosquitoes. And like, I'll take birch bark and just twist like cordage that's 1.5 inches thick, and just make like a foot of it and light that and carry that around just to have like a smudge around, depending on what I'm doing. But also like the black flies here in the spring too. It's definitely fire smudge is the key.
Man, I hate biting flies. I think I hate them worse than mosquitoes. God, they drive me nuts. Especially, you guys have the little ones that look like house flies. Oh, I hated those things living in the pines because they were so fast. I didn't even get like the excitement of killing them because they were too quick for me.
Oh, I mean, we have deer flies too. They get pretty bad later in the summer, but like there's this period of time in like right when the morels are popping where there's black flies, which are like bigger than moppy, but it's the same kind of little biting fly. And they'll get in your beard and your eyes and your ears and your nose. And they're just like, they don't bite like a mosquito where they like put in a proboscis. They just like take 2 sets of teeth and like saw a chunk out of you. And you just be like bleeding. Yeah, but
bastards. So you just carry a birch thing burning
birch
around with you all the time?
Cedar bark.
Yeah, I used to just do cedar boughs.
Yeah.
That was kind of like my go-to. Like dried enough to burn, but like still green enough to have a lot of oil still in them.
Right.
That was definitely like a go-to use of fire.
Yeah.
And you know, like in my shelter, that was definitely a huge thing. Was like even in those hot times of years, like having a really hot fire to dry the shelter out and keep it from getting too funky. One of the people who lived in that shelter, wasn't the year after I left, but the year after that, there was somebody who was living in there, and he almost never had fires in there in the summertime. So it's like, I don't care. And he had massive mushrooms growing out of the walls. He was like, I like mushrooms.
Oh, that's nuts.
I was like, dude, have a fire in there.
Yeah, no, your lungs don't want mushrooms in them.
And in the springtime, it was like, as soon as it got warm enough for there to be a few bugs outside, I'd have a really, really smoky fire inside the shelter. And then you would hear the termites in the walls, like crunch, 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 crunch. And then there would be a hatch. Like you would force the hatch, which was good because if you force that hatch and then they grow wings, they sprout wings and then they fly away, you lose a good bit of them. And usually by that third fire, you're pretty much done with the termites. Whatever had basically snuck in there in the to lay their eggs the previous year, like you would basically force that hatch out there. And then I was still having fires once a week in the shelter just to keep it dry because it gets really wet and moist in a shelter, especially when I had an in-ground shelter. That was like crucial. You had to have those fires in there.
Right.
And I personally only ever burnt down one, so that's great.
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, fire, that's like, another thing I'll use it for that I don't think necessarily folks are always thinking about is like purification and not just of water. Like, obviously, if you need to pasteurize water and get it above the point at which anything like Giardia or leptospirosis can live in it, like, yeah, boil it and that's going to do the job. But things even like a wooden bowl, and like you just ate out of this wooden bowl. Sure, you can scrub it clean with some sphagnum moss and like that's great. But if you hold that thing over the fire till it's like just about to burn, and you can really purify it and like then scrape it back a little. And I found that's a pretty useful thing for like wooden spoons and wooden bowls.
You know what I had for the scrubbing is like you take a stick and then you pound the end of it until it gets like nice, fuzzy, and fibrous, and that was my scrubber. But that thing is not even close to sanitary.
Right.
I mean, there's plenty of stuff living in there. So yeah, passing it through the flames is a pretty easy way to just be like, oh, okay, it might look a little funky, but at least I know there's nothing in there that's likely to kill me.
Right. Yeah, I scrape it and then burn it.
it almost seems like you end up using the fire more for other things than for just keeping warm, honestly.
Right. Well, I mean, other than being in a shelter, fire can only warm one side of you. You know, like it can be nice for drying. Like what we tell students, because hypothermia is such a big deal here, is like you really shouldn't be relying on fire for your plan to avoid hypothermia. Like unless you're in a shelter that can hold the heat, then that's a different story. But if you're outside, then it's only going to warm one side of you, and you can't ingest the calories that it's burning. So, like, it's really good for drying you out because you lose heat 24 times faster through conduction if you're wet.
I wonder how they came by that number. Exactly 24.
I mean, it's just...
Not 23% faster.
It's not percent, it's times.
Faster.
And it's I mean, I've heard 25, but I looked it up and it's 24. It's just conduction rates. It's just a conduction rate between air and water.
So
and
classic.
And
is that the average, or is that?
Well,
like
it's going to change depending on the density of the
accepted?
air. So if you're at sea level, the air is, denser. If you're way above tree line, the air is less dense, so it's going to conduct heat.
Who was the college intern who was crunching that number for those scientists?
Right,
That's what I want to know.
But either way, like...
Were they measuring hardwood fire or softwood fire? What kind of fire were we burning here?
No, it's just conduction of heat. It's just like the physics of how heat conducts. If you have lots of molecules tightly packed together in the case of water, it conducts heat quicker than in air where the molecules have more space between them. And so it's like, that's why insulation works, is because air is a poor conductor of heat. But water is a decent, or liquid is a decent conductor of heat. It's pretty good. It's not quite as good as a solid, but it's pretty good. And then the solids depends on the density and a few other things as to how well they conduct heat. But if you're wet, then fire can dry you out. Like sitting naked by a fire and drying your clothes out, even if it's freezing cold, is a totally sensible thing to do.
Way better. That's way better than being in wet clothes and having your back just like freezing. Yeah, you're cold as hell on your back, but at least you can turn around.
Right, and so
that's way better.
Rotisserie yourself while drying your clothes. That totally makes sense, and that's an art form in of itself. Like drying your stuff by the fire.
What, standing around a fire naked?
Yeah,
that's your art.
Yeah. You know me.
In the Vermont wintertime. Well, you don't have your scarf on this week, so you must have been standing in front of the naked fire earlier.
Right.
Speaking of standing naked in front of a fire, that's like the best. What? That's the best primitive hot shower you can take right there. A huge fire in a heavy downpour. Right? I mean, usually this is a summertime thing, but like that's the best primitive hot shower you could take right there. Huge fire, big downpour.
No, the art I was referring to was drying your clothes out on a fire without burning your clothes. The amount of times I've seen people just burn holes in their socks or gloves trying to dry them out by a fire, it is crazy.
So the naked part is the performance art part of all this.
Yeah, no. You gotta do the noodle.
You need a pine tree pole so you can do some primitive pole dance. Should we keep going with that line of joking, or should we just let that one lie?
No, we can let it lie.
No, man.
We can let it lie. We don't need to talk about the burning your bush or anything like that.
Now we're getting into how do you primitively cut your hair and trim your... You only burn the hair on top of my head. But that is an effective hair trimming method. There's that just on top of your head. There's that really awesome documentary, The Great Dance, and there's like a scene in it where one of the guys is like passing it. He's got a hot coal in his hands, like tossing it around, and they're like tossing it on their head. And the first couple times I was like, oh, that just must be their like their little spiritual thing they do to toss a fire around their head. And then I realized like, oh no, he's cutting his hair. He's like trimming his hair by tossing this coal around on his head. And I mean, obviously you got to move that thing pretty quickly. But my preference is still stones to cut your hair with, but that's totally an effective method, is to just use a hot coal or like the end of a stick that's burning and just hold your hair tight and just pass it through and burn your hair to trim it. That works. It works pretty well. That's how I keep my leg hair nice and trimmed in the wintertime, is by standing naked in front of a fire to dry my clothes.
Oh man, yeah. So the drying of clothes is pretty key. Use of fire up here, and then just boiling water. Just like having a clean canteen that's single walled that you can throw in the fire, or a pot to boil water with. Just for tea, like we work with kids outside a lot, and like if you can make everyone drink warm liquids,
that way helps so much.
Oh man, it's incredible. Like the morale change, and then the warming from the inside effect of that is definitely a big deal.
That morale change is pretty huge.
Yeah, and I mean hot cocoa goes a long way, or whatever.
Where are you getting the cocoa from? Hot birch bark tea.
I mean,
hot maple sap.
Yellow birch.
Oh,
dude, that's hard to beat that. Yellow birch twigs do make a good tea.
I bet.
Especially you throw a little honey in there.
Sphagnum moss.
Black
tea.
birch, if you have it. That's further south.
Speaking of of fire and morale boosts, like smoking. Having like it purposely inhaling smoke. And I always doubted this one until this past summer. At tracker school, one of the tobacco mixes was talk about sphagnum moss. And I smoked some sphagnum moss this summer. There's one of the caretakers had like a little soapstone pipe, and he would just try different like natural tobacco replacements. And man, sphagnum moss was really nice. It was really like mild on my lungs. It wasn't like, it was less harsh than tobacco. I know I'm sure there's a lot of like non-smokers out there who are like, you don't smoke anything, but it's kind of nice, honestly, like to just have something like that oral fixation, it's like something to do to pass the time. I really like that. Obviously like bearberry is like another good one that you might find around where you're at.
Dried mullein leaf
moss was so good. What's funny is the mullein leaf, I've read all about how it's supposed to be good for your lungs, but it's so harsh to inhale it. It's like, it feels so harsh on your lungs.
Yeah.
Like every time I've smoked it, I've been like, damn, this is like good for your lungs? Because it feels horrible.
Well, it's an expectorant,
tobacco.
So it's going to make you cough. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I've had it, I think different levels of it. You know what actually is a really good smoke is when staghorn sumac leaves die and turn red in the fall. That shit is like pretty tasty and sweet, and like for a while it was a tobacco substitute when they couldn't get tobacco in colonial periods, and like the Native Americans definitely smoked it. But yeah, it's a funny use of fire too, and it's funny because like I quit cigarettes maybe 10 or 15 years ago now, but I was a smoker, and like smokers are useful in that they always have a fucking lighter. They probably have too.
So like, true.
Nothing's going to get in the way of that fix.
They spend way more time outside too than non-smokers.
And like all the smokers on survival trips were always like masters of starting fire and moving fire around. They were like, well, if I want to have a cigarette down at the beach, I got to move a coal with me. So like they were like always masters of the long match. Man, like being a cigarette smoker, it definitely teaches you. It's a shitty way of doing it for your health, but you learn a lot about fire and about like how to keep an ember going and how to get a fire from a cigarette ember. Like I could pinch the end off of a hand-rolled cigarette and make a fire out of it, no problem.
I've never been like a regular smoker for any period of time, but when I'm camping, when I'm in the woods, I enjoy to have a cigarette, every now and again. Like I don't know, there's something about it. Like, again, that's just like a morale booster. Probably that's it, I'm not talking about like getting a head change or getting high off of it or anything like that. I'm just talking about like just the enjoyment of like the smoke inhalation. I don't know what that is.
Well, and I mean,
it's definitely a pretty ancient
scout
thing.
classes, I've definitely
been doing
seen
that for many thousands of years.
Right. I've seen a lot of reformed smokers become unreformed pretty quickly, day 2 or 3 of a scout class. when the fatigue sets in, they're like, "Give me anything."
Hold on, I need something's gonna help me poop. Give me that tobacco.
Yeah, I think one dude would come just so he could get away from his wife and smoke for a week.
Yeah, to the scout class.
But yeah,
it's interesting. I wonder how that started. Is that like inhalation of smoke for enjoyment? Did that start with people living in smoky shelters, and then like they missed it in the summertime, and they were like, "Oh, it's smoke on purpose." I don't know what that was for, but there's definitely something to it. I mean, it's this pretty ancient practice across the world. You know, people all over the world.
Well, right, and especially like the herbalist link there of like herbs for medicine. One of the quickest ways to get it into your bloodstream is to inhale it. You know,
yeah, that's true.
And so like the efficacy of smoking for the purpose of getting medicine into your body, like that's. You know, it's one of those skills that's hard to know.
Faster into your bloodstream than eating it.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yeah, and if you can't, like, bring it up into your nasal cavity, then...
Which sucks compared to inhaling it into your lungs.
Right, exactly. Some things you just can't do that. As far as physical pain is concerned, right.
It's nothing. Ooh, that hurts.
Right, and it's
maybe
also...
I'm soft.
Yeah. So, yeah, but I mean, like, I'm sure... It's one of those skills where it's hard to know how old it is because herbs degrade and... But I mean, it's one of those skills that's like as old as Homo sapiens are for sure.
Smoking is a skill.
Yeah.
Inhaling smoke is a very well practiced skill. So you know, definitely another thing that you got to talk about if you're a primitive nerd, not just like using your knife, is definitely shaping things with fire.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, if most everybody who's done these skills has made a coal burn bowl or a coal burn spoon, and super useful as well, but shaping all sorts of stuff, like, carefully using fire to burn certain parts of a piece of wood to like, purposely wear them down so you're spending less time scraping.
Yeah, dude, or even like what you showed us with the banana leaf, where you guys heat up the banana leaf to make it more pliable.
Oh, yeah.
We do that definitely. Shit with birch bark.
Yeah.
You can definitely, yeah.
Or a burdock leaf to cook in, to wrap your food in. Any kind of leaf. Just heat it up over the flames until it gets that. I mean, like, you're breaking the cells down, essentially. Like,
right.
Making them more pliable by, like, probably destroying the edges of them.
Yeah, you're, like, wilting it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, wilting leaves to cook with. And then, obviously, coal burning, people know how to do that. But I'm talking about, like a field expedient spear tip.
Yeah, totally.
Sticking it in the end of the fire and scraping it off, and sticking it in and scraping it off, and then you get a good fire hardened spear tip that way. Using fire as a tool to shape, and then also like for your shelter, charring wood so that the charcoal on the outside of the wood for your shelter posts, which definitely makes a difference. But I've noticed when doing that it only tends to make as much of a difference on a bigger piece of wood. I find that like with smaller poles, like sure, maybe it, instead of lasting 3 years, it lasts 5 years, but it doesn't. I find that when you're burning something to extend its life when it's stuck in the ground, because the charcoal doesn't break down as quickly as the wood, it needs to be big logs, and you need like an inch of char.
Right.
It definitely helps if you could just char the outside of the wood. If it's in contact with the ground, it helps. But I find it needs to be a pretty thick layer of charcoal. But that's another huge use of it. And then, drying your bow stave out, drying your arrow shafts out, like using it to forcibly force the water out. And then pitch extraction. If you're going to use the pitch or the sap of a tree, it's a great way to purposely extract the pitch. So definitely a useful tool, especially since it does a lot of the work for you, instead of sitting there with a scraper, just scraping and scraping and scraping, like sticking something in the fire, letting it burn a little bit, then scraping that charcoal off. I do notice that when people make coal burn bowls and spoons, I do notice people spend a little bit less time scraping than they probably should.
Right.
Because that wood, you're not really helping yourself by charring charcoal more.
Right.
You want to scrape stuff back to wood, but that combination of scraping and the fire, that becomes pretty huge.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many uses for it. Like all the different things you can shape with it. Even like horn or antler, you can bend them more if you heat them by a fire or if you boil them even, which takes a fire. And then there's like ceramics and stone tools, obviously. Like ceramics, there's, drying, preheating, and then the cooking process, like the firing. And then with stone tools, like there's all sorts of different ways that you can kind of like decide what the tool is going to be and how much you want to fire cook it. Right. Do you want it to be brittle and sharp and glassy, or do you want it to be like more durable? And that's only with like the cherts and the flints. Obviously, you can't like fire cook obsidian or quartzite. You're
not going to get anywhere good with it.
Right.
Yeah.
That bluestone that's in your area, does that cook at all?
No, I cooked it so many different ways, and I cannot get a change.
Yeah.
Like not a positive change.
Right. It just makes it more brittle and shitty.
Yeah, honestly, it barely changes it. It freaking like barely changes it at all, unless I totally destroy it, and not even brittle and shitty, but like flaky, like turns into little like shards. You know, like completely and totally wreck it.
That was my experience with the basalt in the Pacific Northwest. Like you could, it was pretty similar to that stuff. Maybe not quite as good to nap, but it was nappable. You could throw decent flakes out of it. But if you tried to cook it, it would just like crumble.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating because I was like, well, this is halfway decent stone. I'm going to start cooking it. And I cooked it so many different ways, and it just never... I should get a kiln, really would be the way to do that, and like try it at different heats for different amounts of time. But I'm like, that's such a... I don't have a kiln for a reason because electricity costs so damn much here.
Right.
And I'm not like burning out solar power for a freaking rock experiment. I'd rather just... cook my flint nappable stones around a fire. I always thought that was kind of funny. It was like, I had friends who were cooking stones, and it was like, oh, let's do it by the fire. Oh, no, I got a kiln. Let's just use a kiln. And I'm like, why are we doing this? like, what are we doing this for? Like, why are we doing this, right? Like, if we're going to a kiln, let's just use a knife, right? Like, let's use a fire. Well, it's less, you can't control as many variables. I'm like, so what, right? Like, isn't this supposed to be about, like, we're making it hard in the first place. Like, why make it easier after making it harder?
Right.
Never really understood that
the argument would be, like, really rare stone or hard to get stone.
Definitely, I'm with you on that.
The kiln is nice. But, yeah, other than that, cooking in a fire is a pretty cool thing, too. Oh, you know what else is pretty awesome with fire? Is a deconstructive kiln. Have you ever seen that? Where it's the process for making like birch tar.
Okay, I gotcha.
The Vikings did it with clay, but basically like you make a reservoir under the fire, and then you make an airtight reservoir, and you pack it full of whatever you want to deconstruct or turn into charcoal, essentially. And so we would pack something with birch bark, and then like put a thin layer of grass and a thin layer of clay over the whole thing, and then burn a huge fire over top of it so that the inside gets cooked, but it doesn't get enough oxygen to burn, and it melts all the oils out of the birch bark, and then the reservoir underneath collects it all. And you could get this
any issues with the grasses, like contaminating the birch tar or anything like that, or I guess the grasses are just...
No, because all the stuff that stays up inside of it just turns into coal. Like the inside of it then is like this birch bark that just looks black, and when you touch it, it just like disintegrates. Like it's like birch bark charcoal essentially. And
I mean, I've done it with a can.
Right. Yeah. And like Netto does it a bunch for making like drawing charcoals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've done the charcoal, but never. I haven't done a primitive deconstruction kiln.
Yeah. It's just a ton of clay.
I've never done the primitive kiln either for pottery firing.
Right.
Either. And it's interesting, you were talking about like boiling earlier, and I just had this story that I thought of as I we went on this hike and we were thinking because there was this stream on the map that we would be okay, and then like this horse trail basically snaked back and forth across the hike, like up the hill from it, like doing switchbacks, and the horses were just shitting in the stream like at every switchback, and we were like, oh well, we definitely have to boil it. And it was like smoky pine fire using the flames to boil water in our pot. And we learned after the first night and a half, like, oh, it can't be flames, and it definitely can't be softwood flames, just drinking really shitty tasting water for a couple nights, so there's definitely like a learning curve to boiling your water. It sounds simple, but you know, like cooking over the coals, I don't know, it's like a tricky thing there.
I mean, rock boiling, like, have you had to exist off of rock boiled water for any period of time?
Never longer than like 3 days.
Yeah,
and I
that's
had a
long
good
enough.
Container.
Oh.
Yeah, I had a good container, so that made it much easier. Yeah, I wasn't like making a field expedient container. We had this big gourd, and we were just using that. And we had good rocks. That's definitely a key for rock boiling, is having good rocks. And I only knew they were good just because it was near my friend's camp, and we had been using rocks for different purposes. And I was like, those are the ones we should use because they stick together the most and they don't smell sulfury. So yeah, definitely having the right rocks. But yeah, if it wasn't for that container, I think it's a lot rougher when you don't have a good container.
Yeah.
It just makes everything harder. But yeah, it was a lot of work, It was definitely a lot of work.
Yeah. In my early days with the skills, and like definitely on some of when I was a student and going on survival trips with other students, like definitely ended up drinking my share of like hot, ashy water.
Ugh.
And it's just the
hot,
gnarliest.
ashy, sulfury, nasty water. Yeah, it's just, no fun at all.
There's such a learning curve to doing that right. And that's like, man, the access to springs rather in this area is pretty huge in terms of.
Yeah, I used to love that about the Pine Barrens.
Just
Didn't
being
even
able
need
to
carry
drink.
a water bottle.
Right.
Yeah, just go and find a spring. It's huge.
Yeah.
Saves so much time. Burns a lot less hair off of your arms.
Also, rock boiling, it takes a shitload of firewood to get enough rocks hot to be, bright red, to then be able to stick them in a fire, and then, God forbid, you don't get it to a boil, and you have to have more rocks or heat them back up, and it can really
And then it cools back down in the meantime, and now your rock is all wet and takes that much longer. Oh, no, it's such a... People think, let's just light a fire and stick rocks in it, cool, and they don't practice that. Like a lot of people.
Right.
I know how to make a fire, and I know how to sit around a fire where rocks are in it.
Yeah, no, man.
But actually doing it, it's like way under-practiced. It's just way, way under-practiced.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely don't like subsisting on rock boiling if I can avoid it. It's so much work. It's like a ton of work.
So we haven't really talked about starting fires very much. Outside of friction fire, I pretty much only use lighters, and almost always like the simplest Bic lighters. Do you find yourself ever using like flint and steel or those magnesium fire striker things, or like?
I mess around with a fire striker because I have students who are like ask about them and like want to know how to use them, and they're pretty simple, but it definitely helps to know how to do it quickly. Like my only trick is pulling the fire starter and holding my striker still. But no, I mostly use a lighter or matches. I'm like, because the magnesium definitely has a plus over the lighter or the matches in that you can get it wet and it'll still work. But it's like if it's wet out, like then my tinder is all wet. So like much easier to dry my lighter out than it is to like dry the tinder enough that little spark is going to catch on that wet tinder,
Right.
And that's also another thing is like the punky wood, finding punky wood and like, using that to start the fire, or like it's much easier to start fire from a coal when it's wet out because, like it dries it out. It has like a base of heat. So that's definitely something that I usually, if I'm on the landscape and I know there's going to be fire, yes, I'm looking for good tinder material. I'm putting that as close to myself as I possibly can. But like, punky wood, yeah, if it's like really rotted, then you need a huge tree and remove a bunch of the punky wood that's on the outside before you get to dry soft wood. But yeah, usually I'm definitely trying to utilize dry punky wood more often than just tinder. It's really helpful.
Yeah, around here with like wet weather bow drill, I have folks, and I personally go for like, there's all sorts of pileated woodpecker holes, and they dig these deep holes into the tree, and then inside that hole invariably is dry dust and dry punky wood, like the ant colonies that they're going after, the galleries that are inside the core rotted tree. That's like what the woodpeckers are going after. You can snap that out and then get a bunch of dust out, and then you can make like a coal extender that's like a clementine or like bigger than a golf ball, and you can put your ember from your bow drill into that and blow that and put a coal that's the size of an egg into your tinder bundle, and if your tinder bundle's damp or wet, you're going to be able to dry it out. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's
without burning your matches out or burning your lighter out completely, burning your fingers on that.
Right.
Like holding those flames on there.
Yeah,
birch bark. You're cheating all the time anyway.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's such a cheater tool that like with long-term students, once they show any proficiency, I'm like, okay, now do it without birch bark. And they're always like, what? And I'm like, yo, the rest of the world doesn't have this ridiculous material that you just touch a flame to and it burns. Yeah.
So awesome.
Yeah.
Like, it's so cheating. I love it. It's great when I have access to it. It's freaking amazing stuff.
Yeah. But I mean, it can become a crutch. It's pretty funny too. Like, it's so damp here in the summer. It's like a wet thicket is what Sarah refers to Vermont as. And we'll have folks come from out west and their fire skills just don't hold up. And it's like, well, yeah, it's 30% humidity there. It's 98% humidity here. Like, it is a whole different ball game.
Difference.
Where like your notch in your bow drill had better be perfect or you're not getting an ember. You cannot get away with some doofy giant fat spindle. You can't get away with like, unless you have the ability to put a lot of downward pressure into it. But like the other thing people fail with a lot here is they'll get wood that's too dead. It's like not quite punky, but it's starting to get there. And it holds shitloads of moisture and it doesn't get to temperature before it wears away. It doesn't
hold up.
Right.
It just wears to nothing.
Right. And so I've seen, especially like the All-Stone Tools kits, people will try stripe maple, or they call it like moose maple, and that stuff does that a lot because its bark is like a wrapper, and so it like rots underneath it, and it like wears away before it burns. Yeah, I have a feeling that piece of basswood we couldn't light, that's what the deal with it was.
I think it was too dry.
Yeah, it was like too dead.
I think somebody played a trick on us with that one right there.
Oh.
I don't often mess with much besides fire by friction, honestly. It's pretty rare that I use the matches or the lighter. That's like if I'm teaching, or if I can't even I bring one for emergency purposes just in case somebody gets hurt. I always have a lighter in my med kit.
Yeah.
Just to like quickly light a fire in case I should need it to boil water or what have you. But it's pretty rare that I use them. And that's why I went to that, like lighting the punky wood with the lighter anyway, because I just find it's like so much, it just gives you more time and more flexibility. I don't have to sit there and break everything down to a tiny little stick. But if I am using a lighter, my preference is super skinny sticks rather than a traditional tinder bundle, because that tinder bundle is going to hold way more moisture than those little tiny like skinny sticks. I'd much rather get a big fat handful of skinny, like pencil lead or thinner sticks and use that big fat bundle. That's going to light way easier when it's wet than any tinder bundle is.
Yeah, definitely.
And even better than the punky wood. But I usually don't mess with it too much. I do play around with the long match quite a bit because they're just so fun.
Yeah.
Like such a fun thing. And here we have the leaf sheath, the palm leaf sheath, like, royal palm or Christmas palm or other palms have where the leaf comes in and hits the tree, and then the base of the leaf wraps around the top of the palm tree, and it's like a cardboardy, it's kind of like bark, like perfect inner bark. And so I mess with that and use that in the coconut burlap and the coconut husk and a few other different materials that I use. But they're just so much fun. Like carrying a coal around for like 5 or 6 hours and being like, all right, let's start the fire, and opening it up, or, Yeah. Yeah, I just love that. I love that feeling of started it 6 hours ago and now I'm going to use it to light the fire.
Yeah, man, dry sphagnum moss works really well for that. You just make like a globe of it and you stick a coal in the middle of it, and you can just keep opening up every once in a while, and it'll just smolder forever, and like the core will just slowly grow, and you can just kind of like move it around and readjust it. But you can keep.
So you're just opening it to make sure you don't smother it.
Right, but like if you figure out the density you keep it at, and it will just keep going and going and going, and like we've kept coals going, like you said, 4 to 6 hours. Move it all over the landscape.
What's the longest you've done?
I would say about 6 hours, I think. And
I haven't done any more than 6 hours. I never needed it.
Right, I was gonna say it could have kept going. It was just a matter of like, well, we're just gonna start a real fire now.
Yeah, I mean, I've read about days, and I totally believe it. If you built it correctly, you could carry fire for days. I just haven't done that myself yet. I've never done much more than 6 hours with a long match.
Yeah.
I do want to mention, if we're going to talk about, like fire by friction at all, because we're talking about fire, I think like the number one headache primitively is the handhold and that socket right there, and keeping that thing lubricated. Like that's, if you're making a fire out in the woods and you just are using what you have, it's like making the spindle. Usually you can get it right. Fireboard, not too hard to get right. Yeah, of course the cordage, can take some time. But that number one thing I'm messing with when I'm around the fire is like the lubrication on the handhold. And that's a all primitive one right there. And that's leaves. I prefer waxy leaves versus any evergreen that I've ever used. But nothing beats the rock, right?
I was going to say, yeah.
When I was doing the TV show, I found that right on the shores of the lake with this perfect little hole in there. And this thing was gold because I didn't have to mess with it at all. Oh, that's your little stone?
Yeah.
Yeah, Carmen uses this thing quite a lot. As you can see by the burning on there, it's a piece of a conch shell. But It gets pretty hot, but because it's so wide, she just kind of grips it around the outsides more than pressing her palm into this part here.
Yeah.
And that actually works decently well.
I've done it with a beer bottle cap, but it burns your hand.
Yeah, I don't like the stuff that burns the crap out of my hand.
Yeah, no, it's more of a party trick than anything. But yeah, it's
which part? The beer? Who kind of parties are you going to where they're like, he did bow drill, but he used a beer cap for it.
It's more just over the life of playing with these skills. At some point, you're like, I'll just use this.
When I have a party with the 5 friends of mine that are into this stuff.
What waxy leaves? Are you talking about anything from here or just down there?
I mean, I guess I was more talking about down here. I'm trying to think about what I use in the States.
Because it's not like there's evergreen needles down there. Yeah.
No, I was using oak leaves, but I still think that like a soursop leaf or like, soursop leaves, passion fruit leaves. There's a couple other trees that grow around here, the black mampoo and a couple others. They're small, but the eugenia leaves, the bunchberry leaves, they're really waxy leaves and they work pretty well. In the States, I've mostly just used like oak leaves, like the older white oak leaves when they kind of are a little bit, not in the springtime, obviously, but later on in the summer. I had to mess with that next time I'm up there. Just mess around with some different. My thing is I'm limited when I'm mostly going to the Pine Barrens, so there's like
Right.
blueberries and oaks, and that's maples, and that's all I'm choosing from.
Right.
But any of the waxy leaves I've used have worked better than evergreen boughs, at least in my experience. Better than pine and cedar. Don't have a lot of spruce where I'm at. I definitely prefer the needles to the sap itself.
Oh, really? I prefer the sap to the needles. It's gummy at first, but once it gets hot, it's pretty damn viscous, and it keeps it from burning.
I find that no matter what you use when it comes to that, it all ends up burning.
Well, right. You just use reapplication is the key.
Well, burnishing, too. Like burnishing the crap out of the end of the spindle till it's, like, super glassy.
Or just switching spots. Yeah. Like, so many times we're working on, like, how quick can you make a kit from collected materials, and, you know, you've got a knife and a piece of P-cord, go. And I'll watch people, like, get into that, or when we do all-stone tools bow drill projects, and their handhold socket gets deep, and they persist trying to, like, fix it. And I'm like, what are you doing? Just make it, just, like...
Make a new one.
Right. And
as small as you can get away with.
Right. The least amount of depth you can get away with. And if it burnishes, great. Yep. But if it doesn't, like, move on. You know what works really well for that around here is if you find a hemlock with a knot.
Oh, yeah, knot in it.
A hemlock knot. Dude, I've had hemlock knots literally chip steel knives. Like, it's like glass. Like, it is...
hardcore.
Yeah, it's some of the best handholds I've made is just, like, right into the base of a branch stump. And on a branch that's been dead for a while, so it's, like, hardened up. All the pitch is hardened up, and, man, that stuff is awesome.
Yeah, super golden. Well, do we have more to talk about fire?
I mean, we could talk about fire forever. We should probably do just like a bow drill episode.
Oh, well, we are doing that.
Yeah.
For sure.
But yeah, this was a good first foray into the land of burning things.
I was looking over to my left and I saw this thing sitting here and I was like, you don't like that. This is my quiver. Right? And the reason why I have it like this at all times is because of cockroaches. I had this beautiful felted wool quiver that somebody gave me that I used for like 15 years. And I loved it. And I had it sitting in the corner for like 3 or 4 months, maybe even 5 or 6 months before I finally started going hunting here, just like regularly hunting. And I grabbed the quiver and I went to go like put some arrows in it, and I grabbed it and I could hear scurrying and I like started shaking the quiver and like a whole freaking civilization's worth of cockroaches came falling out of the quiver. And so I was like, I need a quiver that I can take apart and roll up. So this is the actual quiver that holds the arrows, and I take it and I roll it up for storage so that cockroaches can't get into it, and it is exactly as long as my arrows, so it's completely like, you know, the arrows are completely inside the buckskin, and it's got these pieces of palm here that I use to attach it to this stick. And I'm not going to take the time because it kind of takes me a minute to get it attached. And these 3 points here attached to the stick, and I have found that it's actually not so hard to move through the woods with this thing, because the buckskin, I made it really small. My first number of quivers were really big, and as you can see, like, it's a pretty small.
You don't need much.
That's all I need.
Right.
I'm only trying to carry 4 arrows. What do I need to carry more than 4 arrows for? Right. And so this will just fit 4 arrows, and because it's so small, and because it holds the arrows really well, usually, and also because this stick is so damn big, like, carrying this around, you know, I can... If I'm trying to sneak through the woods, they're not sticking up that much, right? It's like right here next to my head, but I can just take this and swing it down like that when I'm going through a really thick spot, and it's really not a problem. And what I really like about it is I don't like sewing if I can help it, and I was like thinking about how to make it so I didn't have to sew as much. And this part right here that attaches the strap, because I wanted the strap to be adjustable, it's a piece of bone that I sawed in half, and the bone... It comes and then it dips in, so I kind of got an hourglass shape to it, to the bone, and so I cut it where it's basically half of an hourglass, so it's like you know, like I don't know what that shape is. It's not a U shape, right? It's flat and then curves in at the ends. And then I took this piece of wood that fits in the wide part, and I just slid it into the bone, and it just pinches, and it is very tight on there. I've used this for a number of years, and I've only had to adjust it 3 or 4 times, but to adjust it, I just slide the piece of wood out and move the strap to wherever I want it, and then slide the piece of wood back in.
That's cool.
And that way I'm not like taking the threads out and re-sewing it when it stretches out. I'm just like taking the wood out, sliding this forward, pushing it back in. And yeah, I really love this quiver, but you don't like that.
I don't like it.
Basically not.
Not at all.
Doesn't matter what you show me. I don't like that.
Yeah. I'm just going to start showing you Sarah's stuff.
Oh, well, I kind of like that. That's kind of okay.
Since we're on like buckskin projects, here's an oldie but a goodie.
You're showing me your buckskin. That's around the fire while you're drying your clothes.
Yeah. So here's an oldie but a goodie. This is a bag I made. It's a backpack out of buckskin.
You made that buckskin or Sarah made that?
I made this. I made all of it.
Oh, I don't like it.
No. It's got a top pocket here that closes, like you said, with a bone. There's like a pocket here. And then this, I've definitely flaked with that a bunch. And then I've got this stick here.
You got
keep
a
in here.
built-in pressure flaker? That's so cool, dude.
You got a digging/killing stick. This thing's put a lot of animals
cool backpack
into the other world. And then...
Does it have any kind of frame?
Yeah, I built stays into it. So it's got these are pieces of hickory, and they're a little flexy, like just enough to have a little flex. Mm-hmm. And then I put a stay across here too, the lower back stay. And then I took some bison horn and I cut rings out of it. And if you make one ring a little smaller than the other, then you can get adjustable straps.
Oh, sweet. I mean, I don't like that.
Yeah, not at all. And there's a waist strap too. So like this thing, sweet. I could pack really full of material. Like I've had this thing with 40, 50 pounds in it, and
ballooned out with rocks.
Yeah, exactly. Just like full of rock. And it's, this thing is like 10 years old, and it's pretty hard to tell the difference between when I first made it and now, even after a lot of use. I have
buckskin lasts so long.
Yeah, I have a flap for it that's made out of felt. That's like my rainproof kit for it. But yeah, I would say that's the one thing. Like, buckskin's awesome, but man, when it gets wet, it's like a fucking sponge. Yeah,
nasty noodle.
If I could redo that, I would. I didn't know about bark tan then, and if I could redo it, I would redo it out of bark tan. At least like the top flap and the straps and some of the side panels.
Yeah, the parts you're in contact with.
Right, or that like will get rained on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of like wearability or comfort, it's hard to beat buckskin unless you're sopping wet and then you're wearing a sponge.
Yeah. Oh, such a nasty noodle when you're wearing it. Man. I hate that when it gets all wet.
Yeah, it's gross.
Wow. Well,
yeah,
dang.
Man.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah.
We made it this far. Hope you enjoyed it.
Definitely don't forget to like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. I gotta point around. Where's that button? I never remember to put it on there. Wait, that's you.
And do other things to encourage the algorithm. You could share even if you really
give me the algorithm.
Really want to help.
Share it. Share it out. All right. Well, thanks everybody. As always, let us know what else you want us to banter on about. And yeah, hopefully you keep listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Peace.